Good afternoon. Chairman Lewis and Moore, members of the committee, on behalf of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, I thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting us to share relevant information and to respond to your questions. My name is Allison Riggs, and I'm a voting rights attorney at SCSJ. A restrictive photo ID requirement in North Carolina threatens to exclude hundreds of thousands of registered North Carolina voters and will significantly deter those not yet registered from attempting to register and vote. As Ms. Gaskins mentioned, in January of this year, the State Board of Elections performed a comparison between voter registration data and data provided to them by the State Department of Motor Vehicles. That comparison indicated that over 600,000 registered voters, or 9.25% of all registered voters, may not have a DMV-issued license. That comparison study indicated that a photo ID requirement could have a disparate impact on several population groups. Women comprise 54% of active voters, but comprise 66% of active voters on the no-match list. African Americans comprise 22% of active registered voters, but comprise 31% of the active voters on the no-match list. Seniors comprise 18% of active registered voters, but 26% of active voters on the no-match list. These results are very troubling. The data available to us and to this body indicate that voters of color are likely to be disproportionately impacted by a strict photo ID requirement, which raises the potential for violations of both Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Indeed, based on the January matching analysis done by the State Board, the rate of no match in North Carolina's 40 covered counties is significantly higher than in the state as a whole, 10.2% versus 9.25% statewide. To be sure, everyone on that no match list may not actually lack a driver's license, but just because someone shows up on the no-match list and they actually have a driver's license doesn't mean that they won't face barriers on election day if we implement a strict photo ID requirement. The Winston-Salem Journal published an article on January 13th of this year reporting on what they found when they reached out to some of the voters on the state board's no-match list. A woman named Lena Gao was on the list because her driver's license still had her maiden name on it, even though her voter registration had been updated. A man named Kurt Gardner was on the list because his last name was misspelled in his voter registration file. Both of these individuals have photo ID, but the names on their photo IDs don't match the names on the voter rolls. These eligible voters may be forced to cast a provisional ballot on Election Day. Data nationally and in North Carolina show that voter ID laws are more likely to burden voters of color and voters who live in poverty. In August of last year, a 3-judge panel in the D.C. District Court rejected Texas's voter ID law as violating Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because of those very reasons. The court in D.C. found that there are costs for voters associated with photo ID, even when a quote-unquote free ID is provided. That court noted that a law that forces poorer citizens to choose between their wages and their franchise unquestionably denies or abridges their right to vote. Given that in Texas, the poor are disproportionately racial minorities, the court found that the ID requirement violated Section 5. And this may be hard to believe, but African Americans and Latinos live in poverty at a greater rate than they do in Texas. So the very reasons, the factual underpinnings for a rejection of Texas's voter ID law exist here in North Carolina. A final note on data. On November 6, 2012, Dr. Keith Reeves, a professor of political science at Swarthmore College, conducted an exit poll here in North Carolina, polling voters who actually turned out, so not just registered voters, turned out voters, participating in the 2012 presidential election to determine who had photo ID and to learn more about the socioeconomic demographics of those who lack ID. The full analysis is not yet complete, but some preliminary data are available. The study collected surveys from 478 North Carolina voters in 6 counties, a mix of covered and non-covered counties. Poll participants were asked if they had ID and what kinds of ID they had. The poll results indicated that 8.8% of all voters who voted in that election that day did not have a valid form of photo ID. When the analysis is complete, we will have more information, but the preliminary data indicates that of the 8.8% who didn't have ID, an overwhelming majority were African American. Again, this preliminary analysis of exit polling suggests that the state board's analysis released this January is actually pretty correct. A restrictive photo ID requirement in North Carolina is simply not justified by any serious or widespread problems. Here in North Carolina, we are in the unique and advantageous position of having data on alleged voter fraud, and that data is consistent with the national evidence of the rarity of in-person voter fraud. In 2011, the State Board of Elections issued a report on the types of voter fraud and the number of cases of voter fraud referred to district attorneys' offices for prosecution by year over a 10-year period. In that time period, only 2 cases of in-person voter impersonation were identified and referred for prosecution. Double voting and voting by ineligible voters with a felony conviction is likewise very, very rare and is not prevented by a photo ID requirement. Even absentee voter fraud in North Carolina is very rare. We don't have to be content with hypotheticals or voter fraud stories from other states. We have good data specific to North Carolina, and it indicates that voter fraud of whatever ilk is not a significant problem in this state. Because the North Carolina state constitution offers more rigorous protections for voters than does even the federal constitution, the state must offer more than anecdotes and hysteria in order to justify a law that would restrict the right to vote. An argument for a strict photo ID requirement is that it will help, quote unquote, restore integrity in elections. First, as we saw last night, as I saw and as this committee heard, there's a large segment of population that believes this proposed law is a means of trying to keep them from voting, reminiscent of Jim Crow. By my count, not one person of color stood up in front of this committee last night and asked for a photo ID requirement. This does not foster trust in the electoral process. To those voters, there's a lack of integrity in a system that is more about politicians choosing their voters rather than the other way around. Beyond that, a recent study published in the Harvard Law Review found no statistically significant correlation between public perception of the existence of in-person voter fraud and the propensity to participate in elections. Thus, there's no evidentiary support for the claim that the unproven potential for in-person voter fraud decreases voter turnout. I understand the desire to run elections in an above-reproach manner so that we can be confident in their administration and in the results. I share that sentiment. But the law does not tolerate disenfranchising eligible voters because they lack the resources necessary to comply with an unjustified law. One legitimate voter turned away is one too many. In a state like ours, with a sad history of racial discrimination in voting, including the use of literacy tests as recent as the mid-1970s, enacting a law that disproportionately burdens the right to vote of people of color is unjustified, and it perpetuates a tradition and a way of life that we should be happy to relegate to history books. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Riggs. Our final speaker is Hans von Spakovsky, who is the Senior Legal Fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Spakovsky, we welcome you to the committee today and look forward to hearing from you, sir. Thank you.
Chairman Moore, Chairman Lewis, I appreciate the invitation to speak here today, especially since, as I understand it, you had over 4 hours of testimony last evening. This is not Jim Crow. This is not a police dog. This is not a fire hose. And the idea that it is a disservice to those who fought the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Now, what's unfortunate about the voter ID issue is it seems to be has become a partisan issue. It was not a partisan issue in Kansas. Kansas passed a very good photo ID law that not only requires photo ID for in-person voting, but it also requires it for absentee voting. And they put in a requirement that you have to provide proof of citizenship when you register to vote. A majority of Democrats in the state House and the state Senate supported it. The voter ID law passed in Rhode Island was sponsored by an African-American Democratic senator, was also supported on the House side by African-Americans on there. That state is something like 4 or 5 to 1 controlled by the Democratic Party. That law passed. Now, guaranteeing the integrity of the election requires having security throughout the election process. And I should say I know that because I have worked for 8 years as a county election official. I spent 4 years at the Department of Justice enforcing federal voting rights laws against discrimination. I spent 2 years on the Federal Election Commission. I also was used as an expert by the Commission on Federal Election Reform headed by President Jimmy Carter and Secretary of State James Baker, which in 2005 said this: "The electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters. Photo IDs currently are needed to board a plane, enter federal buildings, and cash a check. Voting is equally important." Now, when the Supreme Court upheld Indiana's photo ID law in 2008, which they said was the strictest photo ID law in the country, the majority opinion, which was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the most liberal Supreme Court justices of the Supreme Court over the last few decades, he said, "It remains true, however, that flagrant examples of such fraud in other parts of the country have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists, that occasional examples have surfaced in recent years that demonstrate that not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but it could affect the outcome of a close election." And that, of course, is the key to this. Now, I'm not going to go over what happened in Georgia because Mr. DeLuca has done that. Keep in mind that opponents of this constantly claim that this will suppress the vote, particularly of minority voters, of Democratic voters. It's not true. And that demonstrates it's not true. Now, I heard mention of the 2012 election. People are still crunching numbers for that. But actually, there's a report out. It's called Blacks in 2012 Elections, a Preliminary Analysis. It's put out by the Joint Center for Politics and Economic Studies. I would point out that turnout went down across the country in 2012. We had less turnout in 2012 than 2008. However, in Georgia, when the turnout average across the country was down about 2.3, 2.5%, in Georgia, the turnout of black voters only went down 0.6%, much less than the general turnout across the country. And by the way, that was a much smaller decrease than 3 big states with African-American populations with no photo ID. Illinois went down by over 5 percentage points. No ID requirement, the president's home state. California went down over 4 percentage points. No voter ID. New York, it went down 16 percentage points. So many states without photo ID performed much worse in the 2012 election. Now, I do want to mention Indiana. We've heard about Georgia, but in Indiana, it's also important for you to know that in the 2008 election, when their photo ID law was in place for the first time in a presidential election, the turnout in the Democratic presidential primary quadrupled from the 2004 election. There were 862,000 more votes cast in the Democratic primary than the Republican primary. In the general election in November, the turnout of Democratic voters increased by 8.3 percentage points. That was the largest increase in Democratic turnout of any state in the United States in the 2008 election. And who won Indiana in the 2008 election? President Obama won, the first Democrat to win the state since the 1964 election. In the 2010 election, there was even more black turnout than in the 2008 election, a banner year for it. And the same study I referred to earlier about the 2012 election points out that black voters were the margin of victory in a number of U.S. Senate races across the country, one of them being the Indiana Senate race. So again, the idea this is somehow going to keep people out of the polls is just simply not true. Now, I want to spend most of my time talking about a study that has been constantly mentioned today, and that is the study by the North Carolina Board that claims that 613,000 voters don't have ID in this country. Now, I have to tell you, I was amazed reading that study because it was frankly one of the most flawed studies I've seen in this area. And by a weird coincidence, it's similar to an initial flawed study in the Georgia voter ID lawsuit. There are numerous problems with it. To begin with, when they compared North Carolina's voter registration list with the state's DMV list, they included 106,000 inactive voters. Inactive voters are people who have moved away, have died, who when the board sent them first class. Inactive voters are people who, when they were sent first class non-forwardable mail, the Postal Service sent it back because the Postal Service says they don't live there. That's often because they've moved out of state, because they've died. And what's significant about this is that when Indiana's photo ID law was sued by a number of plaintiffs in federal court, in fact, the expert hired by the plaintiffs in that case included inactive voters when they did a comparison of Indiana's voter registration list against the DMV list, and the court threw out the expert's report saying it was utterly unreliable because of the fact that they had included inactive voters on the comparison. This is shown also to be a problem by a story that I saw in the News Observer. In August 2012, a nonprofit group here delivered to the election board the names of 27,500 registered voters who were dead but still on the list. The board's director of voter registration admitted that the board already had almost 20,000 of these names, and 1/3 were listed as inactive. So they knew about these dead voters, but they listed them as inactive voters instead of removing them, which is what you're supposed to do with dead voters immediately. To include dead voters in your comparison list is just utterly indefensible from a data analysis standpoint. One of the other big problems with North Carolina is that the state does not participate in the Interstate Voter Registration Cross-Check Program. This was started by the state of Kansas. There are now at least 21 states involved in this. What these states do is they compare their voter registration list to find people who have moved out and are registered in other states. In 2012, they compared 45 million records. And to give you an example of what they find, Tennessee found almost 100,000 voters still registered in Tennessee that were now in other states. Mississippi found 164,000, yet North Carolina is not participating in this program and is going to have people show up on this list who very likely have moved to other states. Another fundamental error made by the North Carolina board is they didn't remove UACAVA voters from the list. UACAVA stands for the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. That's the federal law. I used to enforce it at the Justice Department. That's the federal law that guarantees the rights of overseas American civilians and military personnel and their families to vote in federal elections. The North Carolina board knows who those voters are because they're required by federal law to file reports after every federal election with the United States Election Assistance Commission, on whose board of advisors I served at one point, of all the UACAVA voters in the state of North Carolina who requested an absentee ballot, and they're supposed to send them data on the transmission, how many they got back. Obviously, any American overseas has what? A U.S. passport and or a military ID, both of which, as I understand it, are being considered as acceptable for this. Why would the board not remove people who obviously have an ID from their list and who they know and can easily identify? The board also admitted that at least 133,000 of the supposed 613,000 voters without a DMV match actually have a driver's license number in their voter registration record. They couldn't match it up, which indicates there's probably a data entry error. But if they did a better matching process, they would have been able to find those. They also said that those may be the result of individuals whose license has currently been revoked, suspended, or expired. Well, obviously, anybody who had a driver's license here that was revoked, suspended, or expired has all the documentation they need to get an ID. And in fact, that was a problem. You can read this in the Georgia federal court decision on the Georgia voter ID law. That was a problem with the first list that the Georgia Secretary of State put together. She also did not include individuals whose licenses had been revoked or suspended. That turned out to be 200,000 individuals. And given the fact that this state is similar in demographic size to Georgia, that's probably at least that many people on this. Also, the North Carolina board did not do something else which I find rather significant. As I understand it, you're considering also allowing an ID card, a state employee ID card, to be used for this, or a student ID issued by the North Carolina college system. Well, obviously, the North Carolina board is a state agency. They are easily going to have access to other state agency records, including university records of students and the employee records of the state. Why didn't they run their voter registration list against those two state agency records to get those people out of the list? I mean, is that they just didn't think of it? Is that a deliberate failure? I find that astonishing. Also, if you read the report carefully, it says they only did what they call an exact match. Well, what does that mean? That means that if the voter registration record, I'm listed as Hans A. von Spakovsky. I know, good Southern name. But on the DMV list, I'm listed as Hans Anatol von Spakovsky. Then this report would have turned that up as a no match. Now, all they needed to do was a little more research, another data point for comparison, like the resident's address, and they would have been easily able to see, in fact, this is the same person and it's a match. But they deliberately, apparently, did not want to do that. So by using the exact match criteria, they vastly increase the number of people who don't have ID. By the time you take all of these different problems into account, the number of individuals who don't already have an ID probably drops to a tiny fraction of the 600,000 that they did. And again, take Georgia as an example. In 2012, a presidential election year, only about 3,700 people applied for an ID because they didn't already have one. Kansas, by the way, their ID law became effective January 1st of 2012, 1.8 million voters, and from January through September, just before the election, only 120 people in the entire state had to apply for a free ID. Let me finish with this. I've heard people say that, well, all the many other instances in modern life where you have to show an ID, like cashing a check, opening a bank account, when you first fill a prescription, those are not constitutional rights. It's not the same as voting. Well, if you believe that having to show an ID to exercise a fundamental right is wrong, then I suggest you all need to do something about the city of Raleigh. Because in the case called Loving versus Virginia, the United States Supreme Court threw out a ban on interracial marriage in Virginia and said that the ability to get married is a fundamental and basic civil right. Well, according to the website of the city of Raleigh, if you want to exercise that basic and fundamental civil right, you need to bring a valid form of photo ID, such as a passport or driver's license. You also need to bring your Social Security card, which is a much stricter requirement that I understand is being talked about for photo ID. Also, I've heard it said that people who are poor would not be able to afford this. The experiences in Indiana and Georgia show that's untrue. But if that's true, then I suggest you all are going to need to change the requirements that the North Carolina Division of Social Services has out. If you want to apply for welfare public assistance in this state, you're going to have to prove your identity through a passport, ID, or other primary documents. You're going to have to prove your address through a valid North Carolina driver's license, your age through a birth certificate. I mean, it's one document after another that is much stricter than anything that's being discussed here for these voter ID requirements. I would end by telling you that we are the only Western democracy does not require a photo ID when you vote. Canada does. Mexico, which has a much larger population poverty than we do, requires not just a photo ID, they require a thumbprint on the photo ID, and they apply this in all their polling places, and their turnout also went up after this ID requirement was placed in the 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spakovsky. Members of the committee, we're now going to open it up for committee members to ask questions of any of our panelists. And so if there are questions.